I'm at the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. It's the second time they've gathered here in London's Docklands, and they've got about 4,000 people from all over the world. Since the election of Donald Trump, there's been much talk of a vibe shift, of a change in the atmosphere. And here at this conference, you get a real sense of that change. There's some idea of an emerging resistance to the culture which surrounds us, the secular, progressive culture which has done so much damage to our country. And I've taken the opportunity here to talk to a range of people who've been thinking hard about what problems we have and how to solve them. So I'm delighted now to be joined by Emma Webb, now Emma Trimble, actually. Congratulations on your marriage last year.
Thank you for naming me.
Emma, I was very struck. I was just looking at your Twitter feed, and you were jumping for joy at JD Vance's speech last week about just about the things he said. But what was it about that struck you?
I've been a long-term fan of JD Vance since I read Hillbilly Elegy in 2016, and I think he's phenomenal. When I found out that he was running for vice president, I actually had to go and double check because I thought this is too good to be true. It can't possibly be the same JD Vance. But then this speech that he gave at the Munich Security Conference was a surprise, I think, to everyone, especially the people in the room who didn't seem very pleased about it. Their clapping was a bit thin on the ground.
It certainly was.
But everybody was expecting that he was going to talk about Ukraine, China, Russia, the kind of usual stuff that you would expect at a defence conference. Would be focusing particularly on how much money European countries are spending, what percentage of their GDP they spend on the military, that kind of thing, on the harder side of things. And instead he did something completely unprecedented by getting that out of the way very quickly and then immediately going on to talk about the core of what we are defending and in fact making issues like freedom of speech, mass migration, things that the sorts of people who are in that room would want to stay a million miles away from talking about as a risk to security. JD Vance made it about security in two ways. He made it about security in the sense that obviously if you censor people, that has a negative impact on security, particularly if, for example, he didn't mention this specifically, but here in the UK with the Islamophobia definition, people like Richard Walton have said, who's former counterterrorism chief, said very clearly that kind of censorship would damage our ability to do counterterrorism. So there are security implications for, if you clamp down on freedom of speech. And then there's the obvious aspect of mass migration, and this was coming literally just a day after the attack in Munich. And also around the time when we were seeing the guy who was murdered in Sweden for burning a Quran, guy who was arrested here for murdering a Quran, another guy who got stabbed here for burning a Quran outside of the Turkish embassy, even though that seemed to be a protest against the Islamization of Turkey. So there are security implications of all of these things, but it's always the elephant in the room. They never talk about it. One of the speeches that often gets held up as being a very sound speech at the Munich Security Conference was David Cameron's speech, I think it was in 2015, where he talked about muscular liberalism. This was so far and away.
So it was.
It was profound. I mean, it was philosophical, and it was interesting to see the way that people kicked off.
Yeah.
People were really, really unhappy, saying that he was attacking his allies, that he was effectively framing him as being an enemy of Europe, of being pro-Russia, of being a mouthpiece for Russia rather than the United States. But it's absurd because they've just proven him to be absolutely correct.
It seemed such a misunderstanding of what the man was actually saying. I mean, I was struck, like you, by the reaction in the room, which was lukewarm would be...
It was like the applause at a golf tournament.
I mean, they were clearly displeased. But then, after the speech was made, I've been listening carefully and watching, reading the coverage of that speech in the mainstream media. It's as if...
The BBC said JD Vance attacks Europe.
Yeah, I know. It's as if the import of what he was saying just could not be understood. It was so far outside the frame of reference that the media generally works in, that actually the reporting of his speech was nugatory and absolutely, if you were actually interested in what he was saying and what he was talking about, you would have got nothing from the mainstream media.
It was as if they weren't listening.
Exactly.
And actually the fact that they framed it as an attack, when he explicitly, when he's talking about one of the most brilliant aspects of this speech was him calling on them to not be afraid of their electorates. He was making a very explicitly pro-democracy speech, and they're trying to represent him as if he's some kind of authoritarian for calling them out for their authoritarianism. The fact that he said himself the United States has been one of the worst culprits in promoting censorship. So he was making it very clear in the way that he was framing it that he's talking about us, a shared civilization. When he talks about the people, he says our people. So he's very much presenting the United States as being a critical friend to the European countries, to European nations in their defence. You know, he didn't say anything that was remotely pro-Russia. He asked them to up their defence spending so that the United States could focus on the theatres of war as they currently are, which means, as the United States have done, help the Ukrainians an awful lot. So there was nothing about that speech that lent itself to the reaction. It was a complete distortion of what he said. And it was one of the most incredible pro-democracy speeches that I have ever seen. We were covering it live on GB News when he gave the speech, and my adrenaline was high for 24 hours. I was just so thrilled. It was like you could breathe again.
Yes.
You know, it was a breath of fresh air to see him speaking truth to power, to use a horrible turn of phrase, but telling them some home truths that they didn't want to hear, telling them they need to get their house in order, because what's the purpose? How can you understand why it's important to defend yourself if you're not clear about what it is that you're defending? And if you're, he mentioned the Cold War, and they were trying to frame that again as if he was being somehow unfriendly to them. But I think his point was that, you know, you defeated communism, why are you implementing these authoritarian policies in your own country? And that it's those values of freedom of speech, democracy, accountability, and also the right of a people to their homeland, that in the sense that he made it very clear the people of Europe did not vote for mass migration, and so they need to not be afraid of listening to the wisdom of their electorate. It was profoundly conservative. It was almost Burkean. But I think they are so unused to hearing someone speak straightforwardly and hearing somebody speak in a way that is philosophically robust, because he's an intellectual, and so it's really properly founded in a proper political philosophy, conservative political philosophy, that was so shocking to them that they seem to lose their minds. And I think that's exactly why we're in the situation that we're in, and it's exactly why he was right to call them out on all of those things. Absolutely,
and I think a lot of us were, I, like you, was absolutely delighted to hear that speech. And I think actually, funnily enough, the reaction to it, both in the room and then subsequently in the media, illustrates exactly his point, that we have lost sight, it seems to me, we've lost sight of some of the fundamental freedoms which we assume that we embody as a culture. And in fact, these freedoms have been eroded. And that was the kernel of what he was saying, that if we're going to defend Western values, we have to exemplify Western values. And actually, our values are being undermined, particularly on free speech. So you made your breakthrough in the media with GB News, and I think GB News, actually, from my point of view as an outsider, I would say that GB News has broken new ground in the British media scene. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's doing so incredibly well that it has smashed Sky News into the ground. They are very often absolutely sort of trying to think of the right way of putting it, but their viewing figures are higher than Sky News and the BBC. The audience numbers are fantastic, and I think they are giving a voice to people who, particularly on a terrestrial television format, because of course younger generations maybe more so find themselves represented in podcasts and YouTube and this kind of online new media. But particularly for, I think, those people who feel that they have been ignored, that their views haven't been fairly represented. And I think what GB News does an amazing job of, and that I personally really enjoy, is that it allows the sorts of discussions to take place that you would never get on any of the other channels. So other channels will have a very straightforward binary of the expected positions, and they play off against one another. Whereas what I think is so wonderful about GB News is that it really represents people's views in the round, and you can have very interesting and genuinely constructive conversations and debates with people on the left. And I think that it demonstrates to people, in my mind, as I see it, that's how I think people across the country debate at the pub. Yes. These are the conversations that people are actually having around the country, and those are actually being represented rather than this fake concocted binary that is often represented on, say, ITV or the BBC.
Now, I know that you come from a position of faith. I mean, you are a believer. And having worked in the media myself, I know that that's quite an unusual position amongst media-type people. I mean, the media, essentially, in my experience anyway, was a very secularized space, and you don't, overt religious expression is quite a rarity. Do you think GB News was different in that sense?
I mean, I think it's remarkable that I don't think you would ever get this on any other channel. I did a monologue on St. Maximilian Kolbe, and the fact that they allowed me to do that, I think, and it was on the anniversary of his death, I think that that's phenomenal. And it's part of, as I say, that, representing the diversity of views more broadly rather than just this kind of fake binary. And for me, I mean, it's something that my academic background is in theology, and I think it's important to not necessarily to, frame things in terms of the secular just because that's what's accepted in the public square. I like to represent my views as they actually are, on the premises that I have, founded those views, and I think that that's all part of just simply being honest. And I think that honest conversation in the media has been few and far between. That's why GB News has been, has stormed onto the media scene, because the conversations that are being had are honest conversations. People, don't have to. Not that I do. I mean, I do on the BBC also. I frame my views as they are. But I think that there has been a culture and an atmosphere in the media for a very long time of certain invisible parameters of the way that you're allowed to speak about certain subjects. And that isn't not only is that not my worldview, but that's not the worldview that this country was founded on. I mean, Christianity is baked into the fabric of our institutions and our society, and I don't think we can solve our problems without understanding those origins and without being familiar with that kind of framing. So as I see it, I'm just being honest. But in terms of what that does for viewers, I think it's broadening what some people might agree, some people might disagree, but it's broadening the sort of position that people are used to hearing, and I think that's really important.
It's interesting what you say, because people who talk about media and the way debates are framed, this idea of the what is allowable to say and what is not allowable to say, the so-called Overton window. And I do think actually that GB News can take some pride in the fact that it has actually broadened, it has opened a little further the Overton window.
But it's also, I think it's about depth,
yes,
because the conversations are good faith for the most part.
Yes,
and
indeed.
so there's, I think, particularly if you, at least in my experience, if you're on with somebody who disagrees with you and you're on regularly with them and you get to know them, you're starting your conversations from a good faith position, and so you don't have to spend the entire argument defeating a straw man, because you're not misrepresenting each other's views. You understand each other in the way that people in the world do actually understand each other. And so it's not just about the diversity of views and that richness, but it's also the depth that you can get to, which I think is... It used to be, the BBC used to do these really great long-form documentaries where it would be really philosophical and culturally deep, but you just simply... that doesn't exist anymore. Whereas I think GB News are doing something really important in the way that they host those debates, and the diversity of views that they allow on.
Tell me, this thing that we're at today, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, what's your take on it? I mean, there's been a lot of talk today about this being a civilizational moment, that there is something in the air, that people are recognizing a crisis in our culture, a crisis in Western civilization, if you like. That's framing it in rather sort of grandiose terms, but certain people have been talking about that here today in exactly those terms. I mean, do you believe that?
I think we have to be in a civilizational moment. I think that we are at a historical moment of existential crisis. I think conferences like this are really important, and as people may be able to tell from my voice is starting to give up the ghost, it's because I think it's probably about 5 o'clock now, and I've been talking non-stop with various people since 9 o'clock this morning. And
what sort of conversations? All about what we're talking about?
Well, I mean, it's just remarkable to have so many people from so many organisations all across the world in one room. There are former prime ministers here. There are people from all sorts from the arts and so on. And I think that having all of those people come to one place and be able to, I mean, it doesn't really matter so much what you talk about. It's having those conversations and knowing what people are thinking and being able to take the temperature of, where things stand. And the reason why I think things like this are so important is because it's building something.
Yes.
And who knows where that might end up. You plant a tiny seed now, and where will that lead us in a generation's time? If nobody does this kind of thing, if nobody tries to build anything, then you've just given up. And so even if now there might be a lot of people here who think, oh God, this is so futile, not the conference as such, but at least particularly in the UK, that everything feels so futile, so broken, this Labour government are just a complete disaster. And people are maybe feeling even more pessimistic than they were during the first ARC conference. The fact that things like this exist, it shows that, people are making moves. They are building. I mean, look at all of I don't know if people can see from the shot here, but there are stands from all sorts of organisations all across the world. People are doing things. There are things to get involved with. I think that's a cause for hope, because you don't really, I think people think in terms of their own lifetime, because that's the way that our culture is, very consumerist and wanting to achieve things now, and rather than having a sort of generational mindset of where might this lead us in the end. And I think conferences like this, particularly on this scale, I think it's about 4,000 people, it's enormous. I think that's really important in, bringing people together so that they can collaborate on various things. And
it is very affirming, actually, to be in amongst people who are talking about these very things. I mean, as a young person yourself, somebody who...
Are you flattering?
Well, I'm certainly not. It's my generation which has let the side down. It's the boomers, our generation.
Reparations, please.
It's my generation which has seen the systematic dismantling of moral norms and social norms, which actually served us well for generations. Now, do you sense amongst people of your age, can you say that there is a renewed interest in recovering some of what has been lost? I mean, do you think that's true, or is that just wishful thinking?
No, I think there is, but I think that the problem is that the younger generations, and I mean the youngest generations in the sense of Gen X or Gen Alpha, I think that's the correct way of referring to the youngest generation, that they have never lived in the pre-internet world. They are so far removed from, say, the war generation, the greatest generation, that I think were the last generation to really completely embody the values that made Britain great. I think you're right that the boomer generation have let younger generations down. And that's not to pin the blame, because I identify as a boomer, so I am far removed in age. I share all of my views with boomers, but I do think that, and it's part of the general unfolding of history. It's the effect of the 1968 generation, and so many historical currents that it's not really the fault of boomers as such.
You're too kind.
But I do think that there's an issue in that the chain of transmission is very, very tenuous at this point. The thread is thin and scraggy, and if it snaps now, I don't think that we're going to be able to pull this back. And that's why I think this is such a civilizational moment, because my dad was born in the 50s, so he's of the kind of older generation. My mum's a child of the 60s. And I share all of my views pretty much with I say pretty much, I do, I'm a carbon copy. And I think that generation, those who were born in the 50s and the 60s, they saw the twilight of something magnificent. And my generation got to experience the tail end of it, but Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who were born into the internet world, have never met those who were in the First World War. The Second World War feels very far removed from them too. Yeah. And that's something that we don't give a lot of thought to. No. That actually these things have to be passed on in a chain of transmission. You can't mess around with it. Previous generations, for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years, every human culture recognized the importance of tradition in transmitting the things that make society flourish. And the post-war generations just decided to throw all of that out of the window in some experiment that the younger generations now have been left bereft of their inheritance as a result. So even if the younger generation do feel inclined to try and reclaim that, they're going to be lost because they don't have, they don't have a map. And the institutions have been so thoroughly dismantled, even politically. Tony Blair's reforms have wrought unbelievable damage on the constitution of the country, and that's only getting worse under this government as well. So I think that we don't often recognise, even when we talk about these sorts of things all the time, the scale and the depth and the profundity of that problem doesn't get much recognition. And I think it's partly because people think that it's easier than it is to build things up from ground zero. And that's the revolutionary mentality. It's not. Once you've destroyed things, they're gone. and it takes hundreds and hundreds of years to rebuild them. And so right now we're living in the ruins of our inheritance. We might be able to salvage some of it, but it needs to be done now. The longer we wait, the less likely it becomes that we'll manage it on that sort of profound moral level.
I think it was Pope Benedict who said, he wrote that tradition was for generations, for hundreds of years, that's been something that people could turn to as a reassuring, something which can be seen as a sort of protective shield. So this is traditional, and tradition was accorded a certain respect and a certain weight because it was traditional, because those traditions were the fruit of the wisdom of previous generations who had settled on these things which have become traditional because they were good. But progressives see in tradition always something which should be overturned. So it is axiomatic that if you're progressive, anything which comes in the guise of tradition must be discarded. And that, of course, is counter, actually, to a human understanding of culture.
It's rationalist, but it's not rational.
Quite.
Because with a human being, if you've accumulated experience over time, and Michael Oakeshott talks about this in terms of tools. You don't manufacture a new tool for every new job. You use the same tool over and over again. You become familiar with its use. You can apply it to different things. A person that has experience over time, it would be irrational to discard your past experience, because that becomes wisdom. The more that you live, the more that you do things, the more that you learn, that you fail, you figure out how things work, what works well.
Yes.
And the reason why I say it's rationalist but not rational, again, Michael Oakeshott, he talks about the way that the rationalist views tradition as the sort of irrational scribblings of our ancestors, and the first job of the rationalist is to scrub the slate clean. But it's Chesterton's idea of the democracy of the dead. That these traditions are traditions because they work.
Yes.
They are the substrate that our moral sentiments are suspended in. You can't just drain away all of the liquid and then expect things to continue.
Right.
As I think the term that Oakeshott uses is, he basically says that if you try to drink it without the substrate, then you're going to choke. And I think that we, even those of us who are on the sounder side of things, we have to recognize that this is a different paradigm to the rationalist, liberal paradigm that we have been imbibing now for several generations. We need to move back to this understanding of the human being as embedded within its society, as being recognizing the authority of things like tradition, like religion, that these things have something to offer us that allow our societies to flourish. It's like the quality of the soil in a garden is important, or in a field is important. We recognize that. And that's why when you try to plant a democracy in a country that doesn't have the supporting culture, it fails.
Yes.
And what we're doing now, and I think this is why mass migration is such a sort of existential threat, is the rapidity of that change over such a short period of time is inevitably going to disrupt the fabric that allows our liberties to flourish. And that's what you see when censorship becomes the inevitable consequence of multiculturalism, because how else do you manage all of these conflicting cultures unless you impose pluralism on them? If they're not willing to get along with one another, you end up with this kind of plural monoculturalism.
One of the areas where our break with tradition has done the most damage, I think, is in breakdown of family life. And the idea of a healthy society without healthy families is, frankly, a nonsense. You cannot have a healthy and flourishing society unless you have healthy, stable and flourishing families.
Family is the first natural society.
It is. And I wonder if you'd agree that, this epidemic of mental health problems that we're seeing amongst younger people I feel sure that that must be connected with family instability. That so many, if young people do not have, if children do not have loving parents and stable family backgrounds, then that is a big challenge to the developing child.
I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, but the number of children living in divorced households is shocking.
Yes.
I think it's also it's a cultural thing that as a culture we struggle with commitment because we think, and it goes down to this two different paradigms. The idea that freedom is to be liberated from all limitation, or the idea that freedom is something that takes place within an order, within a structure that allows space for that freedom to exist. And I think this is something that obviously affects the family, because any kind of commitment becomes some kind of barrier to your individual autonomy rather than something through which you express your autonomy. And I think there's the idea that you can just express your autonomy limitlessly.
Yes.
Or the idea actually that freedom is cheap, that actually the only way to you're basically giving yourself the freedom to start a project but not to finish it. Sure. And so people end up stuck at ground zero because they think they can build things from ground zero, rather than recognizing that the whole world isn't so egocentric. Cool. And that actually being a part of something is a valuable way to express your freedom. I'm not expressing this particularly well, but I think the idea that you're participating within your culture over time, for me, is much more freeing, because then I'm not limited to my own lifetime. You live on through your children, you live on through, you're having preserved an inheritance for them, and also to have improved it rather than to have trashed it. And it's this Burkean contract between the unborn, the living, and the dead.
I was very struck this morning in the first session where Jordan Peterson, he repeatedly used this phrase, this idea of sacrificial reciprocity. The idea that you don't become a mature man, you don't become an adult until you accept responsibility for others, and that this is something which can be practiced in the home, in the family, in your community, in your wider community, in the nation, in the nation state, at every level. Personal sacrifice, self-restraint is actually the only way to achieve proper flourishing. And it's that, of course, that is an entirely countercultural message, which says that you will be a better person and a happier person, and we'll all be happier for it if you just exercise some self-restraint and don't try to fulfill every one of your impulses to pleasure.
Yeah.
This is
the idea that discipline and freedom go hand in hand was common sense until literally yesterday. Yes. I can't remember who gave this example, but I can't play the violin. I am not free to play the violin. You have to put effort in order to be able to play the violin. Yeah. And then the better that you get at it, the more disciplined you are in practicing it, the more free you are to play the violin. And I think, again, this goes back to this kind of culture of atomization and the lack of commitment. And the internet, because the internet is the perfect endless present, the unlimited space, where no amount of, especially with AI now, no amount of effort has to be put in order to achieve anything. Whereas the idea of tradition is inherently the idea of the wisdom of practice. It's practice across generations. It's the practice of our ancestors that we continue today because we know that it works. We don't necessarily know exactly why it works, but it's like Chesterton's fence. If you don't know why the fence is there, don't move it because you're not sure what the consequences will be. So I think this idea of practical wisdom, the inherited practical wisdom of the generations. As Burke put it, the wisdom of unlettered men. He complained that some of his contemporaries, like the French revolutionaries, were dismissive of the wisdom of unlettered men. And this goes back to JD Vance's speech, because he called out the leaders at the European Security Conference by using a quote from John Paul II. I thought I was going to keel over and die. It was just so magnificent to hear Pope John Paul II quoted during a Munich Security Conference. But he quoted John Paul II, "Do not be afraid," and told them, "Do not be afraid of your people," because they, as he put it, they are smart. And I think actually this prevalent elitism that is part of the problem, so detached from the people, that is masquerading as democracy, is part of actually Europe having given up on democracy, which is exactly why JD Vance was right to call them out on it.
I don't want to keep harping on about how young you are, but you're a representative of a much younger generation than mine. So the baton has to be passed on. The boomers, my generation, are, leaving the stage in the next 10 to 15 years. Will all begin. And I wonder what you, as a young woman, strong views and well-formed, intelligent views about the culture, what are you going to do personally to take this? I mean, do you feel? I mean, is it too portentous to say that you feel a responsibility for this? And if you do, what are you going to do about it?
Well, since I started my career, I started doing research on Islamism, but for me this is a kind of personal crusade. I can't. It's a matter of conscience, and I do feel an enormous responsibility. I feel more pessimistic by the day. I'm worried about our country, and I have seen our inheritance squandered, and I want to salvage as much of it as I can. I mean, I know it sounds grandiose, but I care about England and Britain, the United Kingdom, and I don't want to see her die. I dread to think what the country will be like when I'm your age. And that's not that long from now. But I dread to think when I'm my dad's age, what the country will look like. And if I can make some small dent in holding off decline or improving the situation marginally, I'll have succeeded in something. It's not going well so far because things do seem to be getting worse and worse. But I mean, I'll keep doing what I've been doing since I started my career, which is talking about it, researching it, writing about it. I don't plan to stop because I feel, for example, over the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of talk about Islamophobia and all of the stuff surrounding Quran burnings. I find it enormously concerning that the state seemed to be effectively imposing Islamic blasphemy laws on the British public. But if you were to take a Quran now on camera and put it on the floor, you might get a police officer come knocking at your door because that would be considered as disrespectful. I find that enormously concerning, and I hope that there are other people who feel the same. That you just cannot be quiet about that. You have a responsibility. All of us have a responsibility to ensure that the country and its values and its liberties that we have inherited are not tossed down the drain because of a few people in positions of authority who want to pander to fundamentalists. And I feel that sense of responsibility very strongly, and I am one small person, one small voice, but I want more people to be able, and it's great because of the new media, so many people can.
What about politics? Do you think that would be? I mean,
never say never. Never say never. But I don't have anything on the cards, that's for sure.
Emma Trimble, thank you so much. Actually, it's been a pleasure talking to you. it's so encouraging, actually. As I say, I keep harping on about how young you are, but the point is that actually to hear young people like yourself taking these things seriously and thinking about the future means that actually we don't have to give up hope. I mean, and actually if you're a Christian, you can't give up hope, can you?
I would say to anyone who's watching this, I think the two first steps that every single person can take is go to your pub and go to church, and don't stop going to either of them, because that would do a world of good. Easy fix.